BBC 2's film in a moment is the British TV premiere of Peggy Sue Got Married. Kathleen Turner stars as a middle-aged woman magically transported back to 1960 to find she can make all her choices over again. Well, very few options for Rocky the boxer in our late film on 1 tonight. He must go back into the ring and challenge the world heavyweight champion again. Sylvester Stallone's Rocky 2 at 10:20. Before that, in half an hour on BBC1, Jasper Carrott takes a look at some weird and wonderful examples of television advertising around the world. Carrott's commercial breakdown. Now it's time for the 9 o'clock news with Michael Burke.
The Vatican has accused the United States of occupying Panama and refused to hand over Panama Noriega to American troops because it would be illegal and inhumane. And dozens of boat people are injured in clashes with Hong Kong's riot police. Good evening. The Vatican has refused to hand over the former leader of Panama to the United States. Manuel Noriega took refuge in the Vatican embassy in Panama City on Christmas Eve. The embassy is now surrounded by American troops who want to take Noriega to face drugs charges in their country. Today, the Vatican described the United States as an occupying power, which meant it would be illegal and inhumane to hand him over.
If the general is looking for a peaceful retreat, he hasn't found it here. The Americans are bombarding the Vatican compound with noise, they say to prevent electronic eavesdropping by the news media. But it's also a clear attempt to make life uncomfortable for the general. The Vatican objects to the noise and says it won't turn him over to the Americans.
An occupying power cannot interfere with the work of a diplomatic mission, nor demand that a person seeking asylum in that mission be handed over to it.
And American frustration deepens with the discovery today near the papal compound of the bodies of 2 American civilians apparently killed in the early hours of the invasion. The American death toll now is 26. A paratrooper of the 82nd Airborne, who joined up only last year, was the first of the Army's dead to be buried at Arlington Military Cemetery. But the scenes of grief have not been accompanied by any public outcry against the invasion. The president is off hunting in Texas with the Secretary of State to an upbeat review by the White House spokesman of his crisis performance.
We see him as the same bold, visionary, outstanding, strong, macho, strong, whatever leader he's always been.
And the Democrats, the opposition, are equally gung-ho.
I heard nothing but compliments. Everybody was walking up to us, complimenting us for what the United States has done and the fact that we've restored democracy, and I've never been blessed so many times as I have been in the last day that we've been here.
Voices of dissent are being heard mainly at the United Nations, where the Nicaraguans have introduced a resolution deploring the invasion and calling on the Americans to pull out.
Es la sexta vez que los Estados Unidos invaden a Panamá.
It was the American 6th invasion of Panama, the ambassador said, and their 48th armed intervention in Latin America. But there's no vote yet, and no agreement on who should represent Panama, the delegate of the present government or the delegate of the previous one. Both men are waiting in the wings, and each will be challenged by the other's friends if he attempts to speak. Diplomatic deadlock has set in, and it extends all the way from here to Panama City itself, where General Noriega seems set for another sleepless night if the Americans have anything to do with it. Martin Bell, BBC News, Washington.
Riot police in Hong Kong have used tear gas to break up protests at a detention centre for Vietnamese boat people. 40 people were injured in the fighting, and the police made a number of arrests. The Foreign Office said the police action to restrain the boat people was the right thing to do. But Labour's spokesman on Foreign Affairs, George Fuchs, criticised government policy, saying the unrest was caused by the threat of forced deportation. And the Liberal Democrat leader, Paddy Ashdown, described the camps as a potent cocktail of resentment, despair and frustration, which he said could explode at any moment.
The authorities were expecting trouble in the Chimawan camp following a series of violent incidents. A police tactical unit landed on the island as relief workers and United Nations refugee officials tried to persuade the Vietnamese to cooperate. But that didn't work. The boat people put women and children around the perimeter fence as a screen for the demonstrations in the middle of the compound. Eventually, several hundred riot police stormed the camp using tear gas. The Vietnamese replied with stones. The reason for today's militancy at this prison camp is that it's widely believed the next batch of Vietnamese to be forcibly repatriated will be chosen from among them. The assumption is the authorities carried out today's raid as the first step in the repatriation process. They in effect disarm many of the Vietnamese, confiscating over 400 homemade weapons. Several children were hurt today, and more than 20 police and prison guards. As the rioting went on, another plane load of boat people were willingly leaving the colony. This group, returning home on a United Nations charter flight, bring to 900 the number who've voluntarily gone back to Hanoi this year. They receive generous financial incentives. But they're the exceptions. The bulk of the 40,000 or more boat people here who are unlikely to qualify for refugee status show no sign of giving up. And with Hong Kong pledged to carry out the next stage of enforced repatriation early in the new year, more trouble in the camp seems inevitable. Brian Barron, BBC News, Hong Kong.
Britain's trade deficit with the rest of the world fell last month to just over £1.4 billion, £300 million less than in October. The government described the underlying trend as encouraging, but Labour said the figures were a dismal end to a dismal year.
The city was relieved when today's trade figures showed a smaller deficit than expected, the lowest since last spring. The pound had reached a record low yesterday against the West German mark, amidst fears that a big trade deficit could force another increase in interest rates. Those fears receded today, although Britain remains deep in the red. Britain last had a trade surplus in 1986. After that, the decade's trade declined into deficit, each year producing a new record. 1989 will show the biggest yet, with the final figure set to just beat £20 billion. But next year, the government forecast it will fall to £15 billion. The Chancellor, John Major, is said to be encouraged by today's figures, which he believes shows we're on course for a big cut in the deficit next year. But the opposition say that will still leave us with one of the worst trade records amongst our main competitors.
We end this year, and indeed this decade, with the worst deficit in our history, the worst deficit in Europe, and measures that the government have taken that mean investment in 1990 is certain to be low, and therefore the prospects for industry are grim rather than promising, simply as a result of the measures that have been taken by this government.
Britain's manufacturers played a small part in narrowing Britain's trade gap in November. Once a large sale of aeroplanes is taken out, Britain's manufacturing exports show hardly any growth at all last month, despite recent big falls in the pound's value, which makes British goods cheaper abroad. The main reason for today's improvement in Britain's trade was a big drop in imports, as high interest rates cut deep into consumer spending. But imports remain high, and interest rates at 15% are holding some exporters back. So there's nothing in these figures to suggest that 1990 will be an easy year for the markets, as Britain's trade remains deep in the red.
Vaclav Havel, the playwright who for years was branded by the Czechoslovakian government an enemy of the state, has been sworn in as the country's president. He spent 5 years in prison for subversion, but went on to play a key role in the overthrow of Czechoslovakia's communist government and won massive popular support. Today he promised the people he would not betray their trust.
For weeks the crowds have been chanting Havel to the castle. This morning Vaclav Havel went to Prague Castle to be inaugurated as the first president of the new Czechoslovakia. It was an extraordinary moment as the dissident who spent 5 years in jail signed on for the country's supreme office. Havel's only possible rival had been Alexander Dubček, the leader of the 1968 Prague Spring. But Dubček yesterday accepted the post of parliamentary speaker to leave the way clear for Havel. The new president soon appeared on the castle balcony.
I promise you that I shall not fail your trust and I shall lead this country to free elections. The elections must take place in a clean, decent way in order not to tarnish our revolution. This is a task for all of us.
A decade ago, Havel was one of the lone voices in the opposition. His plays were banned and his home was surveyed by a permanent police post. In the summer of '78,